Welcome to another edition of The Warning, and I'm thrilled today to be joined by Paul Rieckhoff, who is president of the Independent Veterans of America. Paul is a well-known and outspoken leader of this generation of veterans who fought in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, somebody that I deeply admire, and I'm thrilled to have him here today. And I guess to start out, there's a good chance we could be in the same cell block in political prison together, right? If they keep the R's and the S's together alphabetically. So we may be seeing more of each other soon.
Yeah, wild times, man. Wild times. I hope not, but it's definitely a time where critics are going to be under fire and facing all kinds of headwinds we've never seen before. Just one correction. I hadn't served in Afghanistan, just Iraq, but a lot of the last couple of months has felt like all those things and then some, right? I mean, we're in a new normal, and your show is called The Warning. I think that's the appropriate title for the times we're living in and what's happening right now. And a lot of folks are ready to focus on the holidays and take a break or lick their wounds or just go to ground. I mean, this is a time where we need to be especially vigilant and stick together wherever we can. So, yeah, I hope we're not in Gitmo together. But who knows what the next couple of months is going to look like for anybody who's a critic of the president-elect.
I was joking around with a friend of mine, and I said the difference between political prison and regular prison is generally speaking, insofar as I can tell, right? It's not experiential. But if you go to regular prison, right, your worst day is your first day, right? And then it starts to get better, right? So the Menendez brothers, for example, right, they are involved in prison government, and one of them is a meditation teacher. Political prison, on the other hand, tends to be a situation where your best day is your first day, and it deteriorates from there. So we'll have to wait and see. Apparently, and I want to talk to you about this in a serious manner. When you think about the great quotations and the phrases, right, that are part of our daily ritual, like I pledge allegiance to the flag, right? Or is I pledge allegiance to the flag, right? It's like it's one blur, right? These words don't really have an impact, right? And so when you think about people who have had enormous impacts in adjacent moments in time, Franklin Roosevelt, time of real panic. You think about Franklin Roosevelt taking command as commander in chief. 25% of the country is unemployed. And he sat down. He wrote the speech himself. There wasn't the phalanx of speechwriters. He had a couple of people. But like any time you go out, you say anything, right? You have military experience. You've commanded men. You've commanded men in combat. Um, you have to think about what the first thing you're going to say is, right? But what am I going to lead off with here? And for FDR, it was the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. You look in 1981, new pope comes to be in 1979. And, for all the younger folks out there, um, kind of forget what the Pope John Paul was like when he first became Pope, right? This guy was movie star good looking. He was really young, and he goes to Warsaw at the height of Soviet dominance in the era of solidarity, and he goes to a square in front of a million people and he says, "Do not be afraid." And so you look in this moment, Justin Trudeau, Trump lays out the tariff. He jackasses down to Mar-a-Lago to do the capitulation. A couple of weeks later, his government is going to fall as it should. Joe Scarborough, Mika Brzezinski, I think the most brutally obvious of the examples out of corporate media going down there and then justifying the capitulation. ABC News, Disney, imposing a settlement on George Stephanopoulos and on the news division on a suit that they surely would have won. Jeff Bezos at the Washington Post, Patrick Chong at the LA Times. Uh, so we're 34 days out from him taking power. And whatever the first line of resistance is going to be, it's that way. We're retreating, right? The opposition is disorganized. It is flat on its back. It is completely delusional. I'm reading stories about, is Kamala Harris going to run for president again next, or is she going to be governor of California, or maybe both at once? Who knows? And how do you process this moment 34 days out as Trump appears before the national media and basically says, well, I got you tamed. They all nod back at him, and you got to keep being nice. Got to be nice to Trump. How do you assess the strategic landscape politically?
So we went from the Menendez brothers to the
Right?
Pope to Joe Scarborough and everything in between, right? And
Be
maybe
not afraid being the key thematic.
well, maybe I think the question is the right one, because one of my great mentors was a guy named Les Gelb who ran the Council on Foreign Relations, and he used to say strategy is hard. Most people can't do strategy. And I think what you see right now is a landscape that looks like an evolving battlefield, right? And you've got a force that's on the offensive and is taking ground and got momentum and got energy, and you've got a fragmented, disorganized, demoralized opposition and series of oppositions. And I think for me, I go back to being a dad, right? And when I send my boys off to school, we have little sayings every day. I got two little boys, they're 9 and 5. And we say, strong of body, strong of heart, strong of mind, right? And that's how I kind of steel them to think about how they can be empowered to take on whatever is going to come at their day. And I make the brothers look at each other, tell them they love them, and they go in together, right? And every day they're going into the unknown in New York City public school. But when my 9-year-old was a kindergartner, he was going into COVID with a mask and a temperature check, and I couldn't even go in the room, right? So I kind of bring it all back to that, Steve, because I think the most important thing for people, especially Democrats, to understand is it's on. It's been on for years, and now it's fully unfolding. And for these folks that are licking their wounds, or they're doing what Democrats love to do, which is like a lot of listening sessions and roundtables, Trump is pushing his advantage very aggressively right now. He's not taking Christmas off to hand out presents to his grandkids, and he's going to try to run up the score. So what's lacking is a strategy to oppose him, right? And I think what's also lacking is a strategic leader. There is no Churchill, there is no FDR, and no one has yet emerged to be that person for the Democrats or for America. And I've been talking to folks, as I'm sure you have, who are trying to figure out what to do next to get my read. And I said, look, part of it is about betting on leaders. Whether you're betting on Steve Schmidt, or you're betting on AOC, or you're betting on Dan Osborne, who ran as an independent for Senate in Nebraska and almost won, it's not a time where the existing organizations are nimble, dynamic, or even capable enough to respond to this threat. And I view it as a threat. I still view it as a national security threat more than anything else. And the Trump movement now is very close to having the keys to the entire castle. But none of it is normal. None of it is acceptable, and none of it is inevitable. And what we're lacking, because we don't have strategic leaders and we don't have a national strategy or even enclaves of strategies to oppose him, is we're lacking priorities. So people don't know where to focus, and that's to Trump's advantage. He wants to overwhelm the zone. He throws Hegseth at you right after Gates, and here comes Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., and nobody's even paying attention to the fact that he nominated a guy for Secretary of the Navy who's never served in the Navy, or that he's got a very radical pick at the Department of Veterans Affairs that's way below the radar and getting no coverage or even oversight. So that the strategy is to overwhelm the country, overwhelm the press, overwhelm the government, and get as much ground as he can so that the midterms become irrelevant, right? People are stacking their chips for the midterms or for 4 years from now. I'm saying it's about the next 35 days. And right now, I think the most urgent priority is Hegseth, because he is the biggest move at the biggest agency in the federal government, and he's not inevitable. We saw that with Gates, and I think Hegseth is the same situation. But if you're Trump and you're breaking into the house, okay, whether it was your house or someone else's house, the first thing you go for is the gun closet. You go for the gun closet because it's the most dangerous, it's the most valuable, it's got all the symbolic reasons, right? And he knows that the Pentagon stopped him last time. So he's taken a long shot. He's picking the most political, the most extreme, the most not just unqualified, but disqualified person to take over the largest federal agency in the government, not just because it has, and the most significant, not just because it has 2.7 million employees and a $700 billion budget, but because it's the most powerful thing that stopped him last time, right? So if you want to talk about things like federalizing the National Guard to rip migrant kids out of schools, if you want to talk about owning the military leadership so they don't oppose you when you want to do any number of crazy things, the first thing you do is hit the Pentagon. And that's what he's doing. Pete Hegseth is like a political nuke strike. And if he goes through, which I don't think is got to happen, everything else is easy. Right? VA is cake. Education, no problem. You can even, even if he does go down, you can put up somebody like DeSantis and he sails through. So I really think it's important that people understand that Pete Hegseth was built for this moment. He was built as a culture warrior, funded by the Koch brothers, empowered with a spot on Fox News. And we never thought that he would actually get nominated because we knew his personal life was messy. I figured he was going to be chief of staff or maybe press secretary. But Trump is literally saying, and he's saying, you. He's saying, I'm going to roll you. I'm going to put this guy up. And he is a culture warrior. And he's got, tattoos that might be associated with white nationalism. And he's got 3 divorces. And he's openly talked about, having sex with other people's wives. I mean, this is all out in the open. And if he can get Hegseth through, then the Democrats are going to just get rolled. And I really think that's why, I continue to bring focus towards strategic leaders that aren't political. Someone like Admiral Stavridis, or maybe it's a retired chairman of the Joint Chiefs like Mike Mullen. Maybe someone else will emerge. I don't have an answer for you, but I do think that independent Americans, especially people who do put country first, people who took off the uniform, especially veterans who want to continue to serve but don't necessarily want to get in politics. This is a time for true patriots to step up and defend our values. Whether you're a school teacher that has to represent yourself at the school board, or you're somebody that's been thinking about running for Senate, maybe this is your time. But at the end of the day, he wants to roll everybody. And I think that's the most important point about December 2024 going into January is he wants to come out with a head of steam. This is like a blitzkrieg. He's putting it all up front. He wants to push it through because once he gets the keys to not just the gun closet, but the kitchen and the security system and everything else, then everything else becomes easier. So I think it's really important that you lay out that landscape where we can't count on the Democrats. I've never been counting on the Democrats. I don't think you have either. But I think it's kind of a wake up moment for America to go, hey, they're not going to fucking save you here. And we have to look to other leaders and other structures and other tactics and to have a strategy on a very, very basic level to defend our values, defend our Constitution. And let's start with defending our military. From a guy who says he doesn't want women in combat when we've got 200,000 women in combat and has all this other shit. Let's start with focusing on Pete Hegseth and not all the other shiny stuff, because this is a very important fight. And it's the fight that is right in front of us and will dictate, I think, the pace for everything else for years to come.
I want to talk about Pete Hegseth.
That was a lot to throw at you when we started.
No, indeed. I agree. I agree with you. Obviously, he is unfit at such a profound and deep level. It's tough to find the words. I'm going to do my best as we get into it. But I want to play devil's advocate to you about something that I think is fundamental that we ought to put on the table and talk about more in the country, which is an honest reckoning about how we have arrived at this situation in the military. As you know, after every action, there's going to be an after action review. It's important to have an appreciation, right, of how it is that you arrived at whatever situation one finds oneself in order to get out of it, right? And so in that sense, um, let me ask you a couple things. Is it possible that Pete Hegseth could be worse in that position than Donald Rumsfeld and Robert McNamara were?
1,000% yes.
Okay.
Absolutely, totally, and completely.
How?
Because on a very basic level, you may have disagreed with McNamara or Rumsfeld on policy, right? Like whether to bomb Cambodia, whether to stay in Iraq. This is compromising the entire integrity of the establishment. It's making it a political wing of Trump's agenda. And I think that's why this is very important, right? Because everything that Trump wants to get done, on everything from migrants to banning trans people, right? The entire spectrum of his agenda will start with Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon, right? So let's use an example that is maybe not a great one, but maybe like trans people's rights, right? Day one at the Pentagon, they flip the switch. There's a trans ban. Anybody who's trans gets pulled out of a unit. You get kicked out of the military. You get processed out, and we start there, right? It is going to be easier at the Pentagon than the Department of Justice or the Department of Labor or at Education or at Home. The Pentagon is going to be the fulcrum for everything because it will be presented as a position on national security. If we don't do this, the Chinese will have an advantage. If we don't do this, our enemies will be at an advantage, right? And that's going to be true for trans bans. That's going to be true for activating the National Guard.
I want to say that as a political argument, okay, if you lead with we have to protect national security by opposing Trump's trans ban on day one, right? This is the first thing we're running at.
I'm using that as an example because it's the easiest one for him, right? And it's what he ran on, right? It's what he ran on. It's what he weaponized. It's what he used as kind of a boogeyman, right?
To me, right, Trump is going to impose a ban on all transgender service members. They're going to be honorably discharged. And there's nothing
Not honorably, not
that
honorably.
anybody can do to stop that.
Not
Well, they'll
honorably.
be generally discharged.
They'll probably be dishonorably discharged or at least general discharge. They probably won't get benefits. And this is why it's important, right? Because in some ways you could argue that trans people are the most vulnerable or the weakest or the most politicized, right? So you start with them, right? And so when you want to do something like take women out of combat, which is bigger than it seems, because what it is it's saying women are not equal. Right? Women are not equal. That's the bottom line. You can't do the same things that we do, and therefore you will not have the same opportunities, rights, etc. So if you succeed in achieving a lack of equality for women at the Pentagon, abortion rights, everything else is a downhill slide from there. So when you ask me, is he more dangerous than McNamara or Rumsfeld? Yes, because the agenda is much more extreme. I would argue that you can at least count on Rumsfeld on some levels to put country over party, right? He may not have agreed with his allegiances or his politics, but I think on a basic level, there was some kind of integrity there around the institution. And the world wasn't as dangerous, Steve. I mean, we've got a land war in Eastern Europe. We've got the Chinese threat of Taiwan. We've got all these other threats that are real, but also in a position to be exaggerated. Not just by Trump, but by Hegseth, who I think too many Democrats dismiss these people. Hegseth is a masterful communicator. He is brilliant at doing this, at selling, at communicating, at motivating people. And he's a multi-sport athlete who can go on Joe Rogan, but can host a show on Fox and also can tangle with the reporters on Capitol Hill and spin a weakness into a strength. And that's why this is the playbook for the rest of the administration, right? It's the same kind of skill set Tulsi Gabbard has. You could argue it's the same kind of skill set other people in the cabinet have, even like someone like a Kristi Noem. But they're good on TV. They're able to communicate to people, foreign and domestic. And they're good at this. They're good at this thing. You may not like the thing, but they are very, very good at it. And if you have a Pete Hegseth controlling everything from our nukes to who gets to join, right? That drives the culture for the entire country. So if you don't understand why Joe Rogan is important, you probably don't understand why the Pentagon's so important. And that's the parallel that I think Democrats and many liberals in this country are really failing to understand. It's much bigger than about politics. It's about culture and manipulating American patriotism into something much more nefarious, when banning women in combat seems like a patriotic thing to do. Deploying American troops in the streets seems like a patriotic thing to do. And they don't have to get everybody.
Do you think that's going to happen? Do you think we're going to see troops in the streets?
I think you will see Trump attempt to federalize the National Guard, which is the first like critical crossroad. You know, it might be January 20th. He declares a state of emergency, says the migrant crisis is out of control. I'm federalizing all National Guard units. Now, what could happen is every Republican National Guard governor, well, every Republican governor, that is the commander in chief of the National Guard, says, no problem. Here's Alabama. No problem. Here's Florida. Now, what happens in Illinois with Pritzker? What happens in Maryland with Wes Moore? Do those governors say no? Do they say you can't have my National Guard? Do they fight it out in the courts and then take it all the way down? What happens to the National Guard soldiers?
Well, if he federalizes it statutorily, right? He's the commander in chief. He's got them. He's federalized it.
Take it the next step down. Now you say, okay, Maryland National Guard troops, you're going to be deployed to round up, let's say, extreme example, like round up kids, migrant kids. Some number of them are going to say no. Some number of them are going to say, I think this is an unlawful order. I am not going. I'll go to jail. So now you've got the military not only rounding up kids, but jailing a certain number of their own people who are now in conflict with what Trump will argue is a lawful order. They will argue it's not. And I bring it all back to this, Steve, because Ross Perot once famously said something like he wanted a monument in front of the White House that said, first commit the country, then commit the troops. If you thought Iraq divided people, imagine what it's like when you federalize National Guard troops on the migrant crisis. This is Kent State on steroids. And that's why when people say, is there going to be a civil war? I don't know. I think more importantly, there's going to be a constitutional crisis around how and when to use the military. And if you've got Pete Hegseth there and a bunch of undersecretaries who are willing to do it, and you've got all the senior leadership gone because he's fired the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and everybody else who hasn't taken a loyalty test, you've got a steamroll that can start to move forward.
This is really the heart of what I want to talk to you about right today. So what will happen is Trump will get in there day one. He's going to pardon everybody who was convicted of an offense on January 6th, with the exception, I suspect, of the hardcore, violent, seditious extremists like Stuart Rhodes, the guy with the eye patch.
Yeah, and the guys who they have on tape.
Right, but possible, but these people will come out and they'll be celebrated. He will execute that trans ban that you talked about in the military, and he will use it politically as a wedge issue. He will also set about firing the senior leadership of the military. He's going to fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, an Air Force 4-star. He's going to fire the chief of naval operations, the first woman to rise to that level in the United States Navy. All of these people will be gone.
And make an example out of them too, Steve, which is key, right? Because right now, I have lots of friends in the Pentagon who've worked on a number of controversial issues. And this is really, really important for people to understand. Not only will he fire them, he'll probably put them on blast. So Colonel Snuffy, who, I don't know, for example, was a part of the crew that changed the names of military bases from Confederate leaders to non-Confederate leaders, right? They're all on Tucker Carlson's list now. Their names are out there. They've been publicly outed, right? They're out of the military. They have no more salary. They don't have security for their families, right? They all become General Milley. They all become Fauci. And that is a very dangerous thing, but it's also got a chilling effect across not just the military, but every other organization.
Of course.
Yeah.
Right. So how deep do you have to go, or you not have to go so deep at all for ambition to take root? How I mean, what MacArthur posited, right, to the class of 1966 when they were freshmen at West Point was the long gray line has never failed us: duty, honor, country. So you make a mockery, right, of all of these virtues, all of these standards, all of these ethics with the Hegseth nomination. You also have the reality that you have somebody who sits atop a chain of command involving nuclear weapons that levels below him regarding their release at, say, the '06, I'm the captain of a nuclear ballistic missile submarine. Nobody who had the problematic drinking that Hegseth has would be allowed to be the captain of a submarine. And the Navy, for example, is different than the Army culturally in that the Navy relieves senior commanders, captains of ships, all the time. Very difficult, right, to get relieved as the brigade commander of an active duty Army unit, judging by the numbers. Not so much in the Navy, not so much in the Marine Corps, but in these services, two of which that have the standards for you can't do those things or you're out. You have an Army captain who was promoted to major at the end of his service in the National Guard, who has gone to none of the upper military level graduate schools, has no core competency in the diplomacy, the strategy, the nuclear deterrence doctrines, none of it, right? He's a Fox News morning host who is going to be put forward by Trump, who, in the Trumpian way, Trump is not all in on this guy. He's letting him swim a little bit and
Yeah, yeah,
watching it go out.
yeah.
I have I have an 18-year-old son who is very seriously thinking about I'm thinking about going in the Navy, right out of high school. He's like, I'll go to college later.
Hmm.
And my position is on this over my dead fucking body. If, if, if the US senators are so disrespectful, so fucking careless, so profoundly indifferent that you can't get four of them somewhere in the middle to be like, yeah, no,
Hmm.
the fuck out of here.
Hmm. Hmm.
Not this guy.
Hmm.
No way. No how. Not her. And not the whack job at the FBI.
Hmm.
Because if they do get through, as you say, right, the orders will be conveyed and they'll be expressed to the command structure of the military through the secretary as a legal order.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
is the job of the secretary to be the first line of defense to say, no, that's an illegal order. What you talked about is, I think, the very chilling scenario, which is he calls to active duty National Guard troops, and no one can stop that taking. And you have a deployment of red state National Guard into blue states.
I don't know if they'll do that. That's the question, right? Like these are the kind of questions, right? And that's where we don't know. I think, if I can pause there for a second. Number one, like, I'm getting a lot of those phone calls right now. Hey, my son or daughter's thinking about joining. What would you tell them? I'd say, first of all, if he or she is 17, it's not up to you. They can do it on their own. And so,
Theoretically.
right, you got to hope that they've laid the foundation and they're going to make the right choices.
Hmm.
But I think it's the right question, because when you talk about all these nominees, I would give them what I've called the school principal test. Would you be okay with Pete Hegseth or Kash Patel or any number of them being the school principal for your 17-year-old daughter? And I'm using daughter specifically, right? Would you be okay with that person being the principal of your 17-year-old daughter's school? If not, why are you okay with that person being the commander or the leader of your 17-year-old daughter in the Marine Corps? Because that's what we're offering them up to do. It's not like they're just going to run a Walmart here. I mean, they are the moral, functional, bureaucratic leader that your kids, for those especially that have kids in the service, are going to have to look to. But I think there's a bigger thing here, Steve, when we talk about all these elements. I don't think the Democrats realize how bad they've lost. Like this is so much gone, right? Because it's not just the institutions. Like MSNBC that you and I are on all the time, right? It's so tiny, and CNN is so irrelevant. And they could be gone, gobbled up by Elon in 3 months or a year, right? They're losing in the media. They've lost all three chambers. They're losing in fundraising. They're losing on sports. They're losing on culture. They're losing on gender. They've lost so many things that you have to understand that, because they're all interconnected. Because when I say he's going to fire generals, he's not just going to fire them. They're going to be on Elon's Twitter feed, right? And the level of intimidation and the way this whole flywheel is going to kick in is really faster and more dangerous, I think, than most people realize. So when people say, "Oh, Fox News host," that's kind of who you want for this moment, because he knows how to pull all those levers. Pete Hegseth, again, ran political organizations that were funded by dedicated donors that invested in Pete Hegseth 20 years ago. They built him for this moment. And then he had a corresponding seat at Fox. So when the Republicans wanted to bang on Obama about the VA, and they wanted to punish the Democrats and make them look weak on national security, Hegseth's been doing it for years on Fox. So this is an example of how it can all come together. And I think this activation of the National Guard is really important, because they're the narrator, right? They're going to narrate this to America. And you're going to have these subordinate narrators like Tulsi Gabbard or like Pete Hegseth. They're going to echo that. So I keep coming back to, like, who are the narrators that are going to rise to this moment? It might be a new Colonel Vindman, right? Maybe a state level commander of a National Guard who says, I'm going to stand up and say no. And he gets dragged out in handcuffs, right? Like, there are going to have to be people that emerge right now that are beyond politics, that are trusted, that can counter that narrative, because maybe that's the most important part of all this is Trump has already started writing this.
I want to get into like the details of this, like for the audience. And so your service, you served in the Army. You were a captain, right?
Mm-mm.
Were you an enlisted?
I was a lowly platoon leader in a grunt unit in Iraq for a little less than a year. Yeah, so I mean,
So you're a lieutenant, right?
Yep,
You're a
yep.
Okay. So Lieutenant Rieckhoff in the New York National Guard. You're hanging out, right? It's January 30th, and you get the call, right? Unit has been activated, right? It's been federalized, right? And just so everybody who's watching, the way that this works is that the military is structured, has an active duty component. It has a reserve component. Reservists can serve on active duty, and they do all the time. And it has a National Guard component. And the National Guard, the commander in chief of the National Guard on a state basis is the governor of the state, and unless and until they're federalized, right? And so there's examples, right, of instances where the president has enforced federal law using the military.
New York's a really good example, because New York's probably been activated more since 9/11 than any other state, right? I was on federal orders, state orders, the people who were on the tunnels, the people who were at ground zero. I was at ground zero after 9/11. I think we weren't even formally activated. Then some units were on state orders. Then some units were on federal orders. But really, like, post 9/11 is a really good example, because even Pete Hegseth his National Guard unit was federalized for January 6th. And he was flagged for being a threat, as an insider threat, because he had a tattoo that was associated with extremism. His unit took him off the line. So yes, so Christmas time, there are going to be these warning orders. Hey guys, we're going to get activated. And it's probably going to be like something around a migrant camp, migrant security, migrant escort, migrant transportation.
Let me walk you into this, right? So I was saying, right, there's just so everyone watching, right, there's precedent of this, right? And, one of the great examples is Dwight Eisenhower, right? 1954, the segregationists will not abide the in Little Rock, Arkansas, will not desegregate the schools. And Dwight Eisenhower, now the president, but former Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Forces, sends in the 101st Airborne, right, to desegregate the schools in Arkansas. So there's a difference, though, between Trump saying, hey, I'm going to deploy the 82nd Airborne into the interior of the country, and Trump saying, I'm going to deploy these units of the New York National Guard here, there, or whatever. Now, Lieutenant Rieckhoff gets called up, right, and they say, hey, you, Lieutenant Rieckhoff, and your men are going to go stand here, right, in Brownsville, Texas, right, and there you go, and there you are. Now, you have no legal basis whatsoever, right, to refuse the order, right?
Well, that's the question. Like,
Well,
here's the question, right? Like, if I am that guy, and I've been that guy, okay? Like, I got deployed to go to Iraq. I volunteered to go to Iraq, right? But there are plenty of us who said, you know what, I don't agree with the Iraq war. I'm getting deployed, right? And I'm sure there are cases of people who said no, isolated, conscientious objectors, which are different. But this is the real constitutional crisis, right? You're going to have whether or not governors are going to oppose the actual activation. But then it's going to cascade all the way down to, look, like a place like New York, safe to say 30-40% of the people in the National Guard are Democrats, right? They probably didn't vote for Trump. They probably don't want to be deployed in a migrant crisis. I got thrust into the national consciousness because I was a National Guard person who came home and criticized George Bush in 2004. I was still in the National Guard. When I did that, people told me I was going to be tried under the Hatch Act. There was no precedent at that time for this like melding of the National Guard and Reserve that happens now, where Tulsi Gabbard, apologizes for Putin, but she's still in the National Guard in Hawaii. Like, these lines have been so blurred since 9/11 that I think it's really like a reckoning on some levels, Steve. But it does come down to those individuals, and I don't think you can kind of cast aside that any number of them knows, if I say, fuck it, I'm not going. Yeah, I might go to Leavenworth, or I might go to a jail for a little while, but the ACLU is probably going to defend me. I'm going to have 1 million people listening to me on TikTok. I'm going to have an immediate platform. And this is going to birth, I think, a new generation of a different kind of anti-war activist. That's what I was. That's what Cindy Sheehan was, what other people were, right?
what I hear you saying, right, and I want to talk about it, right, is that people are going to disobey lawful orders, and the
They're going to
law.
argue that they're not lawful orders,
Well,
which is different, right?
I get, but arguing, for example, I'm Lieutenant Rieckhoff in the National Guard, and I don't agree with the Iraq war, and then I'm not going. No doubt you're going to have a lawyer that will take your case and argue your position. But from my perspective, right, you have no legal basis whatsoever fucking ever to refuse that order, in the same way as if you're the commander of a platoon in the motor pool in the New York National Guard and they tell you to deploy to fucking Texas because you've been federalized, your platoon goes to Texas because you're in the United States Army. And if you don't want to go to Texas, right, you'll have no sympathy whatsoever from me, no more so than the Taylor Lorenz position, right, of, hey, I'm joyful, right, because this guy got shot in the back, gunned down by Luigi Mangione because of the pain I'm in for the healthcare companies. And it's the worst conceivable way, right, to resist Trump because it's unlawful, right? And because nobody, because Paul, because nobody has told you to do anything illegal other than to saddle up as part of the all volunteer force to go to the place they've told you to go.
Whether or not we think it's illegal, right? Like, and I think this is a really important scenario to just kind of think about, right? Whether or not we think it's illegal, right? This is a country that celebrated Snowden. This is many people who celebrated Snowden, who celebrated WikiLeaks, who thought Julian Assange was a fucking hero, right? All of which I disagree with, okay? But if this person or number of people take this stand, you may not agree with them, other people may not agree with them, but they're going to be on Chris Hayes like that. and they're going to be out in the public. And this is where the dynamic is really different now, and especially because the civil military divide is so skewed. And Trump is in part done that by politicizing the military in so many different ways. But we all wanted to know, what was Vindman going to say when he got out, right? Well, Vindman got out, and then we heard what he said. Right now, if you kick that person out, or even if you don't, that person can pick up their cell phone, and the country is so starved for opposition. And there may even be illegal grounds for the kind of deployment, what they're asking this person to do, whether or not it's legal across state lines. That's going to end up in the courts. And the most important thing is, Steve, it's going to be, I think, a kind of constitutional crisis, definitely a civil military divide crisis, and it's going to rip the country in half. And it's going to rip our military in half. And that's why this is all so dangerous, because when you politicize our military, it is the most dangerous thing to do. Again, think about Iraq as an example, Afghanistan as an example. Now we're talking about whether they're federal or they're state, because he also could send federal troops down to the border and do other things. You are politicizing the military on a level that we've never seen. And I've started to call these people out. They're chicken hawks. The people are saying, hey, send the National Guard down to Texas, or send them into migrant shelters. Do you think I want to be Lieutenant Rieckhoff carrying a rifle in a migrant shelter in Brooklyn, surrounded by protesters and everyday else?
This is the question that I'm trying to get to, and I think this is why kind of this where the line is important. So no Democratic governor has any legal basis whatsoever to say you can't have my National Guard.
I don't know that. I don't know that. I don't think you know that either.
Let's stipulate this, right? Because they don't, right?
But they could argue. They could argue
misuse
of resources.
Under the National Defense Authorization Acts, Paul, they just don't, right?
I think there will be at least one Democratic governor who will challenge it. I don't think they're all just. I don't think Kathy Hochul and West and Pritzker just going to say, here's my National Guard.
Paul, there has to be in the country a place where there can be non-crazy conversations, right? And so hope this is one of those places. But I want to just let's just go with this.
Yeah.
Okay. A Democratic governor cannot tell the president that you can't activate my New Jersey National Guard. They can't.
They can. They can. There's nothing stopping them from making, even if it's a political charade. Okay, there is nothing stopping.
Then they stand.
What is Newsom going to do? What is Gavin Newsom going to do? Hold on,
Paul. There's no military. I feel like we can't get to the important point because we're arguing on a detail that I'm right about that you will let go of. But
we'll come back. Come back in 2 months. Right. And see. I'll come back and just show it 2 months.
I'm not saying that one won't try. And I'm not saying, right, that they may not be lionized. I'm saying that they will not be able to stop it, not for 2.2 nanoseconds. They have no legal authority whatsoever, no basis. If Trump wants their National Guard troops, a squad, a platoon, a company, or all of them, and he federalizes them as National Guard, they go. And they go to wherever it is he sends them. And so there they are.
So what if he sends them to Mexico City?
General Grant said when he went to Mexico City as Lieutenant Grant that his evaluation of it was that it was the most unjust war that had ever been. But he went to Mexico City as you went to Baghdad, as the commander-in-chief has the power, right, to deploy the military, as you would know better than I right now. We're in how many countries? How many?
21, 22.
How many?
21 in combat? Like
how many countries is there an American soldier in right now?
I mean, 100? I don't know. How many?
I mean,
right? When you look it up, I don't know. Like
it's 100 at least, right? So there's no authorization for that. So my question is, when you're there in Texas on that corner, and the order comes, and the order is we start rounding up the migrants at the schools today, right? This is the spot where I think legally now you're in an interesting territory where all of the ethics, all of the ingrained teachings, right? The American soldier says,
Yes.
this is an illegal order.
Yeah, I mean, it's so apparently we have bases in 55 countries roughly, right? But there's a lot of places we don't have bases. It gets blurry. But I think this is kind of the real 2024, 2025 world we're going to live in. And let's just I want people to envision, like, let's say he says it's going to be like like the Lieutenant Calley is taught in the schoolhouse, at the infantry school and the officer school, about what not to do. He used him as an example from Vietnam on a case where you should refuse an unlawful order. If the commander comes over and says, hey, Schmidt, shoot all those kids, you have an obligation to say no to that unlawful order. Now, the problem is it's never that simple. It's always much blurrier. And a very real scenario could be, okay, there's a bunch of kids in that school. There's a line of protesters who are saying they're not going to let you in. Bust through that line and go get those kids. Now you're asking that your 18-year-old kid or your 19-year-old kid is now that private in the National Guard who's got to bust through a line of protesters with every camera in the world watching and go, let's say there's only 5 kids in it, but there's a criminal inside, right? There's one criminal inside, right? This is literally what we went through in Iraq on steroids, right? Hunting all over the place for people and pissing off the population along the way. And that's why maybe the most important point of all of this that the warning for your show, right, is of our military and of patriotism and of all of it. And Hegseth is the manifestation of that. But it's not just him. Trump is very smartly casting the entire season of this episode with people like Tulsi Gabbard and people like the EPA nominee, Lee Zeldin, right, who ran for governor in New York. And Trump said his qualifications to be an EPA administrator is that he was in the Army Reserves and he knows about bureaucracy. Like, he's going to use this shield of military, veteran, and patriotism on everything. And that's the warning. That's the thing to watch out for, because I know people care about all their different issues. But national security and global security is always got to be paramount. And that's my warning to everybody as we end December and go into January, whether it's Justice Department, whether it's Hegseth, if it feels like it's always all overwhelming, remember that our enemies are celebrating. Putin loves to see this, and Osama bin Laden's dream would have been to see us in a situation where you and I are debating whether or not National Guard troops are going to have to kick in schools and drag out migrant kids.
When you think about the military in the streets, and so you think it's going to happen, right?
I don't know if it's going to happen in the streets, right? Like, if you have, it's more likely that you do things like have them drive trucks, or they provide medical support, or that's what I would do if I were going to soft sell it, right? You have to drive trucks and do medical support and feed the migrants, right? But Trump doesn't know the difference between the different units, and he's probably going to be asking for the Navy SEALs to go get a Mexican criminal in Bed-Stuy.
Let me ask it this way. I just drove across the country last week from New Hampshire to California. Did not see a lot of cops and saw no military vehicles on the highways. When I drive back in 5 months, is it going to look different?
I think so. I think so, because he can also, look, this is why it's dangerous, because you activate them for the migrant crisis. What if you feel like Portland's crime situation is out of control? What if you feel like, lower Manhattan has got too many homeless? Like, it becomes your instrument for executing everything. And it starts with those incremental steps. This is how you get Japanese internment camps, right? I mean, this is how it starts, with those increments. But what he's doing is setting the pieces in place to have all the crazy shit go through the system without resistance. From him to Hegseth to the purge of the Pentagon of all the officers, then all these crazy things that he wants to do cut through like a knife through butter, right? There's no more Milley. There's no more chairman of the Joint Chiefs saying, hey, sir, this is a bad idea. Those guys are all fucking gone. And you got an army of Hegseths and an army of Kash Patels, including the civilian authorities all the way down in those political positions. And you hope that the government people who've been there for 20 years, the people who run the Pentagon, you hope that they stay and try to be a buffer. But a lot of them are just going to fucking check out. They're going to say, I don't want this. I'm going to go sit on a beach in Florida where my taxes are lower and enjoy the DeSantis land. There's plenty of people who are going to do that. And the other piece that's critical here, Steve, is the recruiting will change. Yeah, your kid might not want to join, but like a MAGA loyalist who loves Pete Hegseth and listens to Joe Rogan, he's fucking joining. He loves this. There's no trans people in the military. I don't have to take a COVID shot. Sign me up, man. I'm ready to go. And it begins to turn into the MAGA army, right? It begins to turn into the MAGA army rather than this beautiful, diverse, lethal fighting force that we've got right now.
Sounds great.
Isn't it great? Merry Christmas, Steve. Merry Christmas, everybody.
All right. I want to like talk to you about politics for a second, just straight up. So
we haven't been talking about politics,
right? We're talking about something deeper, I think, but just raw campaign politics. Do you see anybody potentially running as an independent candidate under I'm going to fix the country, put the country first, who's a person of stature, and that person will come from the military. It'll be a senior military officer who is deeply experienced in the security of the country in my estimation, right? If there is to be such a person, right, who comes forward. Now, if you think about an independent candidacy, and I've been involved in an effort where somebody did some diligence around one, and I think it's an interesting intellectual proposition that you have this duopoly that has produced Donald Trump. And I've read a couple of these stories about what Kamala Harris is going to do next, whether she's going to run for governor of California, run for president again, be both at once, and they bring me to the edge of aneurysm. Right, nowhere in any of them is any talk whatsoever about the person wants the office for what reason, to do what, to serve what purpose. None of it. Right, it's all about the ambition. Now, what the Democratic Party establishment, right, was very good at, right, over the last couple of years is when you saw some of these bubbles come up is, spoiler, screaming, spoiler, right? I think the whole concept of maybe the Democrats shouldn't field a candidate, right, in 4 years. Maybe they're the spoiler, right, electing Trump, right? Maybe they should just run candidates at the gubernatorial, U.S. Senate, U.S. House level, and there can be some sort of process outside of the Democratic primary process where somebody comes forward and run for president without having to go through all the bullshit, right, and play all the games, right, that produce a result that's corrupt enough, right, for Donald Trump to win. Right, but do you think about like when you independent veterans?
This is my focus now. I mean, I believe that the future of American politics is independent because our past was also independent, right? Like George Washington was the last independent president we had, and he was also a veteran, right? And what I think is the future is people who are leaders first, who are independent of the duopoly, and are judged on their own merit on a more level playing field where they can have not just ranked choice voting and public financing, but also open primaries and ballot access, all the things that they're prohibited from or they're blocked from having or made difficult for them. And I think that the truth is the biggest group of voters in America and the fastest growing is independents. 51% of Americans call themselves independents. More people who voted this time call themselves independents than call themselves Democrats or Republicans. 60% of young people are calling themselves independents, and they don't want to be a part of No Labels or Andrew Yang's Forward Party. They just want none of the above. They think it's all fucking broken. They want to put their country first. They think they can have 100 options on Amazon for a couch, and they shouldn't have only 2 options for president. So the next generation is demanding this. And I think what you will see is an emergence of candidates who can respond to that or who come from that. And we believe that many of them will be former military people. That's why we started Independent Veterans of America. We think they will be the forward edge. They will be the easiest to understand because this is a group of people who put country first and have done that their whole lives. So making that transition is going to be more understandable for people. We had 11 candidates who ran, 4 of them won. 3 of them that lost by less than 5%. Like Dan Osborne, maybe most notably in Nebraska, ran as a Navy steam fitter. He ran as an independent against Deb Fisher, who was an entrenched MAGA Republican, and he lost by less than 5%. But that's the best showing by an independent candidate for Senate in modern history. So if somebody runs for president, and I think it's important to pick examples, right? Not just let's just not talk about Ross Perot or talk about like if The Rock ran, right? And everybody says, oh, The Rock, The Rock. Well, Donald Trump's pretty fucking ridiculous too. And plenty of people thought Ronald Reagan was ridiculous. But let's just run the model, right? Let's say it's Kamala Harris again against Donald Trump and The Rock runs. Run it through the model. He will at least be competitive, right? And you could run that same model with Admiral McCraven. You could run it with Oprah. And then you could take it down to the state level and do it with Matthew McConaughey in Texas, right? Or do it with Mark Cuban for Senate. And I think what you're seeing is the country is finally fed up. And what we have to create is the infrastructure and the pathway for these people to be viable. And we are doing it by starting with veterans. We ran 11 this time. In 25, we're going to run 25, 25 and 25 for things like mayors, like mayor of Omaha, mayor of Buffalo. We are recruiting right now for veterans. But we would put the call out to everyone, whether it's local school board or it's Senate. We think that there is a movement about to tip. And what you've seen so far is the imperfect offerings like No Labels and Forward and RFK Jr., but they're all tapping into something bigger, which is that the country generally considers itself, the majority of it, independent. And they want leaders first. And it's not even compartmentalized by a platform. People say, well, are independent people against Medicare or for Medicare? I'm like, it depends on the person. Like you're going to have to do the work and evaluate each one of them. But you look at Dan Osborne, right? He was pretty quiet about Ukraine. He said he was going to support union rights. He was going to come after corporations. He talked tough. He had tattoos and he used to make $40,000 a year. A lot of it's just about leadership. Like people know a leader when they see it. And if real, authentic, patriotic leaders step forward, and if waves of them come, and I think the waves are going to come most acutely in veterans, former sports people, and celebrities. They're going to be the first waves, right? And then you can get on down to more normal people. But I think the opportunity is there, not just 4 years from now for president. We think the opportunity is there in 12 months for local offices, for school boards, and for plenty of other races in 26 and 27 leading up to 2028 when who knows where we'll be. But I do think the future is independent and the country wants it.
One thing that you said that I just like, I can't align myself in agreement more with is nobody understands how badly they were beaten. And everyone processes this the wrong way, which is they count votes as opposed to the totality of the leveling. And the vote total gives you reason for optimism, right? Is that wasn't that big a victory and it's a plurality win, but the totality of the destruction wrought on the side that managed to lose to MAGA is astonishing. And so the one thing that Mark Halperin said that I thought was going to happen, it may still manifest itself. He predicted that if there was a Trump victory, there would be the biggest mental health crisis in American history, right? And it hasn't really come to pass.
Oh, give it some time. Give it some time.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. Right. I'm not ruling it out.
Yeah.
But the thing that for sure, right, for sure has happened is this I don't know what you call it, but it's this astonishing kind
Reckoning.
of
Reckoning.
like that you had the senior leadership of the campaign earnestly and honestly believing they ran a flawless effort.
They still think that. They still think, but I think this, everybody keeps saying, is this a mandate? Here's the thing. It's not a mandate, but it was a sweep. right? And when you win the World Series, if you won it in 7 games, you won it in 6 games, you won it in 5 games, doesn't fucking matter. You won it, right? And you get the parade.
It was an
And
ass kicking.
yeah, well, even if it wasn't an ass kicking, it was a total victory, right? And that's the most important. It doesn't matter if you win by 1 run or you win by 10, you won, right? And they won in all the key areas. And that's what's most important. But it was also simultaneously a rejection of the Democrats on a level we maybe have seen before, but haven't really been looking. Pat Ryan is a friend of mine who now the Democrats are running to Pat Ryan. They're running to all like, let's find the Democrat who can help us understand why they won. And Pat sent an email that said, Pat is a different type of Democrat. And I wrote back and I said, but he's still a fucking Democrat. They don't understand. Pat is a great candidate. I think he's a great public servant. He also ran against a woman who was openly gay. And most people thought that she was the Democrat and he was the Republican, right? So, like, there's these other pieces of this that people aren't fully understanding, which is that the Democratic brand and the Democratic establishment is completely shattered, and maybe even more so than the Republicans, because at least the Republican Party functions. You may not like the way it functions or what it's focused on, but it actually functions quite effectively to achieve what it wants to, which is to win elections and take power, right? So I think what you're seeing is a reckoning on some levels. And the Democrats are holding on to power. The grifters and the establishment and the system is all holding on to keep it going and give it another run. We promise you we'll get it next time. But I think most Americans, a year from now especially, will realize they're fucked with both of them. And they're not happy with both of them. And they want alternatives. And the question now, Steve, for you and for every candidate is, can I be an alternative? I am putting forward alternatives that I think are viable, and they're independent veterans, right? They're winning at state races because people say, oh, I like this guy. Nick Batter lost by 100 votes in Nebraska against a Democrat who spent over $1 million. I think he spent less than $100,000. The fact that he even came close, right, shows you that the thirst and the interest is there. The fact that Kennedy could get the kind of support he did. People want an alternative. They just don't want Robert Kennedy. If that alternative was somebody more viable, we would have had a very different landscape. So I think we are in a moment where leaders are going to rise, and the opposition to Trump most effective opposition and counter to Trump won't come from the left. It'll come from the middle. The angry, unheard group of people in this country that is really starving to get power and to take the country back is not MAGA Republicans. It's moderates. It's independents. It's the majority of this country.
If I remember in high school we had a football practice where the coach yelled at us to like put down the footballs, right? He's like no one's going to touch a football today, right? He's like we're just going to practice lining up and running.
Been there. Been there.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I feel like the Democrats need some practices like that, but if
I feel like we have to stop putting them on the field. Don't even
if
let them on the fucking field anymore. That's the dynamic that needs to change is why do they, and this is really the important part. What my friend John Updike, who runs open primaries, is really, really effective and been, I think, an important leader in democracy reform for many, many years. He said, when you have closed primaries, as an example, you're letting them field a candidate and they're the referee, right? Yeah. So the Democratic Party, as an example, runs closed private elections in my state, uses my kids' public school, uses public resources to run a closed primary that I can't even vote in because I'm not a Democrat. Like that is what we have to tackle is the fact that the Democrats have closed out competition. So I don't even want them on the field, much less running the scoreboard and the referees. I want them to have to fight for that field on an even playing field with Dan Osborne or The Rock or whoever else, just like everybody else. I think that's where the real action is. Right. And the Republicans knew it. That's why they tried to keep primaries closed in, I think, 20 states over the last couple of years. Because if you let the independents in, that upsets the entire apple cart.
The point I was going to make is that if we were a retreating force, the opposition, which definitely includes the Democrats, what we would be saying to everybody in camp is pick up your shit, pack it up. We got a lot of walking to do.
But I'm not saying that. I'm saying take it differently. And this is what Democrats need to hear. They're not in retreat. Hold the ground you've got, dig a hole, and make them run you over because if you retreat, they're going to keep coming.
And I use that analogy because I think you have to have ground that you can fight from. And the current position is indefensible. It's scattered, it's disorganized. There is no line. So everyone's got to pick up their shit and start walking that way until we find the first place to defend ground from. And what is that, do you think, is going to be that first MAGA overreach, right? As we get forward, you're going to see a cascade of executive actions, of pardons, of fire hose, of nonsense. It's all going to be normalized, sanitized. Most of it's going to be packaged as Trump is winning, he's succeeding. Look at his application of power and authority and wisdom. The whole organizing principle of the media is going to be nice to Trump. He's going to start doing all of this stuff. I'm a rejectionist of the idea that it will be popular, right? If we are, in fact, right, entering into the golden age of America led by the MAGA Republicans, and you and I are two people as wrong about anything that two people have ever been wrong about anything about, and we're going to be totally discredited. I don't think that's going to happen. But where is the line, right? That is it 20 days in? Is it 30 days in? Is it on immigration? Is it on the deployment of the military? Is it on the confirmation hearings where people look at a couple of these people and are like, holy shit?
I think this is a really good question because here's if you ask Zelensky, where's the line? He'd say, my whole country, right? He wouldn't say, oh, you know what? I'm okay with giving up the Donbass. I'm okay with giving up this. I'm okay. That's for other people to say, right? Like, what would we be okay with? Would we be okay with giving away Texas, giving away California, giving away Alaska? I think that the mindset of Democrats is not even relevant to me, right? Like what I'm talking about right now are patriots. What is important to you? And everybody's going to have to draw their own line, just like in combat, right? Yeah, we're trying to move together as a unit, but there is no more unit. The unit has been shattered. Your commander is dead. Like everybody is kind of fighting on their own. And what you start to do now is you get these little cliques, right? It's like Band of Brothers when the 101st Gen, you hook up with other guys with the clickers and say, hey, you got a clicker? I got a clicker. Let's see what we can do, right? And that's where we are right now is people fighting for the things that they hold sacred before Trump rolls over them. So for me, and I think for a lot of veterans, it's the Pentagon, right? And it's this nomination because Gates, for many people, was the line, and they stopped Gates. You could argue Gates is gone. Crazy thing he tried. He's off the board, right? I think that Hegseth is the line, and it's not just about the confirmation hearings. This is a test of the Republicans. This is a test, obviously, are any Democrats other than Tammy Duckworth going to stand up and say anything? Are they all going to start folding like it sounds like Fetterman is doing and many others, right? Where are the officers within the military? Are they going to find ways to speak out? Are they going to find ways to try to push back? Where the fuck is the press? Right? It's going to be a test of everybody. And Hegseth, in my view, is the most immediate and the first real test, because Gates wasn't really a test. Gates was, whatever it was. But Hegseth is the big Hail Mary he's starting with. It's the big shot he's taking. And for me, that's where I am right now. I'm hunkered down here. I think you have to try to stop Hegseth. And of course, somebody else crazy is going to come.
Do you think that Hegseth, great point
It's
you
also,
made.
Steve, it's also winnable, right? You have to pick winnable fights, right? You
Well,
owe
it's
people,
winnable. It's winnable. It's winnable if you can hold all the Democratic votes.
right? But regardless, like in the beginning, when he got nominated, everybody was like, "Oh, this is going to happen too." Right? People think Tulsi is inevitable, or that RFK is inevitable. None of this is normal. None of it is acceptable, and none of it is inevitable. So the real problem, Steve, honestly, is getting people to not quit. Like you can't get worn out. You can't check out over the holidays. You got to keep fighting. I know you're tired from fighting, but you got to keep fighting. And right now is arguably the most important point because you want to stun his momentum. You know he's going to get the House. You know he's going to get the Senate. He's going to get Supreme Court nominees. So look across the board. There are plenty of people who said, we can't stop Gates. Those people, I want them out of the room. I don't want them in my foxhole anymore. Right? But other people know you can stop Hegseth, you can stop RFK Jr., you can stop Tulsi, you can stop Kash Patel, and you do it by reminding people what's most important and talk about the basics, give them the principle test, and explain why you shouldn't have a radical guy who wants to blow up the FBI running the FBI.
Are we going to see military officers? Are we going to see senior, retired, enlisted sergeant majors, master chiefs of the Navy, retired 4 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars, brigade combat leaders who say, at a colonel level, who just say this guy's unfit? Or is
I wouldn't
everyone
hold your breath for it, frankly, right? Because like if you look at the last 20 years, like very few of them spoke up against anything ranging from I don't know, everything um from Afghanistan going on for 20 years to the Iraq surge to even things like torture. Like maybe that's like when John McCain was saying, hey, we shouldn't torture people. A lot of people in the military just shut the fuck up and do their job. And that's on part what they're doing because they trust that the military will be isolated from politics. So we're at this new normal now, right? Where they can't trust that the systems will keep things in check and that Congress will function normally. So I don't think, honestly, Steve, like you might get a McCraven or you might get a Kelly or you might get Milley, but don't hold your breath. I think you're more likely to see kind of like a next generation AOC. Right? I use her as an example because she came out of nowhere. She was so talented. You might see a sergeant. You might see a John Kerry, right? Like someone who captivates the country and is able to communicate in a masterful way. Like you look at the school shootings, right? Some of the kids that came out of the school shootings. I think people are always looking to the senior leaders. I think there are some young people that know how to play this game, that know how to do the multimedia landscape. And those are the folks that are going to emerge very quickly and become like instant superstars.
do you think obviously, I would, if I was president, not nominate Ron DeSantis to be the Secretary of Defense. But do you process DeSantis and Hegseth as materially different?
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah. Because Hegseth has built his entire life for this. He's
Right.
been built for
You
it.
would vote, if you were a senator, you would vote to confirm DeSantis.
Probably not. But, I mean, I don't know. I'd have to see how the hearings go. And let's see. I mean, Ron DeSantis has never said he wanted to be defense secretary. So I think everybody should, at a minimum, say they want to be it and explain why and argue why they're qualified, right? I
I
think we
guess
all
like
argue.
here's the point I'm trying to add. I'm trying to
And
gauge.
he's much less, right? If you had somebody like Joni Ernst, obviously, Joni Ernst, you can also run the clock out. You can say no to all of them and just jam up the works, right? That's another strategy.
I'm asking the question. I'm trying to get a gauge on where you are, like dispositionally on the issue. Like for
Yeah,
me,
I mean, DeSantis
right,
is infinitely better than Hegseth.
right. Like for me, right, like my disposition on this is that presidential elections have consequences, that there is an advice and consent, and right, that means you get a say. Well, I wouldn't pick them, but I didn't run, and if you're the Democrats, we didn't win, right? So for example, I'll give you a preposterous pick that I would vote for, right? Is Kimberly Guilfoyle. I would vote for Kimberly,
First
right?
defense secretary?
Yeah, I would
For
vote.
defense secretary.
I would vote for Kimberly. I would vote for Kimberly to be ambassador to Greece. If I was a senator, under my theory of this, right, I would use my nose sparingly. I'd be like, the American people have voted for this. It's not like any of this shit's a surprise, right? Any of these freak shows that he's going to put. So I'd be like,
I
yes,
just think at the end of the day, what Trump is trying to do is wear everybody out. And yeah,
right.
some people might go along to get along. Some people might pick their spots. But if you have a functioning opposition party, you've got all those different spokes working together, right? You've got somebody who's going to be the radical, who's going to put the hold on it. You got somebody who's going to be a tough sell, somebody who's going to be right away, right? But all that's supposed to work in concert together, and you don't have that now. So for me, if I'm a U.S. senator, I'm betting the shit out of all of them. None of them are acceptable until I'm proven otherwise. So many of them are not just not qualified, like openly disqualified, right? Conflict of interest as an example. Like if you lower the standards on any level, it becomes easier across the board. And I think that's why, yes, advise and consent, but also every candidate is supposed to get a certain level of rigor, and we can't let him overwhelm the system.
Right. So for example, like Pam Bondi, right? Pam Bondi is a registered Qatari agent. So like to me, like
Disqualifying, right?
he can't be the
Disqualifying.
attorney general, right? That's totally disqualifying,
Yeah.
right? I'm
Okay.
like,
So
get the
boom,
fuck
there
out
you
of
go.
here.
All you
No,
have to do on these people right now, honestly, is like find out what disqualifies them, right? And what everybody's doing on Hegseth that's really important, and I keep going back to this, like, the example was set. Joni Ernst got smashed, right? She stuck her head up. She was reasonable. Well, you cannot be reasonable right now. You're going to get smashed. They'll threaten to primary you. And she said, okay, now what she's basically saying is, I'll wait till the confirmation hearings, which is also a way of saying, I'll wait 4 more weeks to see if any other crazy shit comes out, right? And that is probably a more strategic way to approach this because people haven't been nominated this far ahead with this much crap, right? So there's a lesson learned there, right? Which is wait, but at the same time, will you be able to adequately evaluate Hegseth while you've got 6 other nominees happening? Because he is trying to overwhelm the system, and people have to stay vigilant. They have to uphold their honor, and they have to hold the line for the American people who elected them to do this.
I think that we are in store for some extraordinary times, out of which will come reform and renewal, and the American people will awaken, but sometimes suffering must be experiential in order to be believed. And I think there's a real lack of imagination in the United States about the nature of terribleness. And COVID doesn't measure up on the scale with what's coming potentially. And I think it's really frightening, and indifference is really what you're talking about at the core, Paul. And I think that the fighting spirit that you bring to the table is something that's, really, really important. And, encourage people to get involved, to support independent veterans for America, and to be engaged in politics, right? It doesn't belong to the Democratic Party. It doesn't belong to Trump. It doesn't belong to the Republican Party. And the American citizen has a lot of recourse, has a lot of power, has a lot of rights to stand up and organize and to make a difference. And what we're about to enter into, I think, is a great age and a great era of taking, where we're going to see people take as much as they can take until somebody puts a stop to it. And that will always ultimately happen, because one of the things that's almost providentially been true about the country is the right people have stepped up at the right times, or have found their way in the right moments at the right time into positions where they were able to stop the things that needed to be stopped. None of those people have been perfect people, and the ones that are coming aren't going to be perfect either. But they are out there, and when you look at what's coming down the pike, there's going to need to be a lot of really committed, conviction-based opposition to it. We found ourselves in a terrible place right now in this country, and in the first rule of holes is when you find yourself in one, stop fucking digging. And if you look at the last couple of weeks, every person who's capitulated to Trump and claimed they did it for us while practicing the gospel of self-interest
Mhm.
has nuked themselves, whether it be Justin Trudeau in Canada, whether it be Morning Joe, whether it be the ABC News division. And so um, it's going to be interesting to see, I think, in the months ahead, where that line gets established and where people fight it out. But I'm with Paul 100% and couldn't agree more. I'll give you the last word here, Paul, but it's the Secretary of Defense. I was having a discussion. I don't think he'll mind me sharing it. It was about the hypothetical of, well, if you could only stop one of Trump's like most unfit nominees, who would it be? And as I've had this conversation with people, and the guy I was having it with was John Nichols at the Nation magazine, who's as smart and as decent a guy as there is. And a lot of people are talking about go to Tulsi Gabbard, and you're like, well, obviously we'd stop Tulsi Gabbard. And John and I agreed with each other, which is that we followed the breadcrumbs to the nuclear weapons, right? That the person
Yeah.
who's in the chain of command with our 5,413 nuclear warheads, that's the person that we would focus our attention on. So I think you're completely right. You have the most unfit person that has ever been nominated for a position of responsibility within the National Command Authority, a legitimately accused rapist, a person who clearly has a drinking problem, a person who's been condemned by his mother, of all people, as being abusive to women, who is disqualified from inaugural service because of the white nationalist tattoos on his chest, a Fox morning television host and polemicist who is a divider and who is an inciter and who is unfit morally, mentally, spiritually to preside over, in the end, what is a position that requires some degree of moral authority at least. And so it is an urgent mission to stop the nomination. It must be stopped. It must be opposed. The dignity of the armed forces of the United States um, is at stake. And this last point, MacArthur talked about this in that 62 speech, is that the military and the American soldier and the legacy of the American soldier, as MacArthur talked about, does not belong to the military, nor even to the veteran. It belongs to the nation. And the nation should be revolted by the idea of Pete Hegseth leading the Pentagon. So I have been as outspoken as a person could be about Donald Trump. And 2 out of 3 times he ran, more voters agreed with me than with him. One of those times he sliced it through the Electoral College, but on one of those times I'm in the minority position and you're in the minority position. A plurality of our people in a country have bestowed lawful authority to Donald Trump. And he's going to be the commander in chief. And we have an active force of over 1 million young men and women primarily. We have people all over the world in harm's way doing dangerous things. We got another 1 million people roughly in the reserves in the National Guard who could be called on to do difficult and dangerous things. And these people deserve respect, and
Yep.
they deserve competent, able, moral leadership. Um, and and Donald Trump was not elected to vandalize these places. He was elected, according to him, to make them great again. And there's no formulation where placing a drunk, an accused rapist into a position that Pete Hegseth is being placed into makes anything great again. It has one purpose, which is to fucking wreck it. And with that, let me give you the last word here, and tell people by all means where they can find you.
Well, happy holidays, everybody. If you're
Ha!
still listening, Steve has called this show The Warning. I hope that we've moved beyond the warning and are now into the action phase. Because your after action review military comparison is a good one, but you also don't always have time to do an AAR because you're still deep in it, and we are still deep in it. And I think that's what I would ask everyone to remember is that, vigilance is the price of democracy. And we've got to be vigilant right now over the holidays and always. And it requires just basic citizenship and being aware of what's happening. So I think vigilance is what's required now. It has to transcend party. It's about, what I said, the principal test. Are you okay with these people being your principal? And if you need another test, okay, the nuke test, also a good one, right? Is this a person who'd be fit to have control over our nukes? In contrast, Steve, after we finish, I'm going to go record my annual Festivus episode of Independent Americans with Jason Alexander, who is actually a very, very deep and thoughtful guy, he's a grandfather, and I'm going to ask him about America. Because I think we need all voices right now to help us, to soothe us, to guide us. But it's a time to go back to wisdom. It's a time to go back to values. It's a time to go back to family. and just look at all these issues through the lens of your family around the holidays. I don't know how many people would be excited about Pete Hegseth sitting at the kids' table for your holiday. I would not be. Okay. I would have him under guard watch if he was next to my kids or next to my wallet or next to my wife. Right. But I do think that there are amazing people in this country who will rise to the moment. I don't know who they are, but I know that independents especially are well positioned to be those people. If anybody's listening and they're an independent veteran, go to independentveteransofamerica.org. We want you. And if you're not interested in running, you can help support those who are. Check out independentamericans.us. You can get it on YouTube and Spotify and everywhere else you get Steve's show. And we're going to keep this conversation going, but you can't give up, right? And I don't think you can give up an inch of your integrity. And that's ultimately what this is all about, is about the integrity of our country and looking our kids in the eye and telling them what you did during this time. I think we're going through something, Steve, that I would call a political, cultural, intellectual depression. It's going to be a Great Depression. And we've got to figure out, how are you going to get through the Great Depression that you heard your grandparents talk about? That's what we're facing. And we're going to have to strap in and get ready for it. But we will endure, and we can get through it if we stick together and look out for each other. And most of all, just remember that we're in it together. And it does transcend party lines, especially around the holidays. It's a good reminder. Don't let the bastards get you down. And don't let this guy divide us. Like, be nice to each other and be kind and focus on the future. And we can pull this one out in the late innings and live to fight another day. So thank you, Steve, for the forum. Thank you for the support, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays.
Shut the news off once in a while, okay? And try to take care of yourself as you would in combat. Make sure you're eating, make sure you're sleeping, spend time with family, because you got to brace yourself for a long fight. That's what we're in for. And we just got to outlast Trump.
Paul Rieckhoff, everybody. Great American patriot, great veteran, great future leader in the American political fight that is far, 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 far from over.
Thank you, Steve. Merry Christmas.
I'm Steve Schmidt. This is The Warning, and I invite you to subscribe on our Substack, on our YouTube channel. Follow us. Welcome to the community.